Okay, we're recording.
Okay. Happy Monday afternoon, everyone. Transportation Task Group conversation. Feels like maybe we can have a shorter meeting today. Got some very dedicated, committed folks and time constraints from others. So a few things just want to cover: advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks, update from you, Megan, there, if that works for you. And Andrea, if there's any update on the carbon reduction strategy and that important big piece of work underway, and then talk about the transportation memo prior to the November meeting and any input you might have all received from Secretary Moore, secretaries. Okay. Megan, do you want to give us an update about all the good work you guys are doing in a short order? Oh, can't hear you for some reason.
Yeah, you're muted or.
Okay, that worked. Sorry. Every time I plug in my headphones, my computer gets very confused. I don't have much to say. We're just kind of plugging away at the responsiveness summary and doing some updates to our economic analysis. I think I might have mentioned to this group that we were offered 50 hours from Atlas Public Policy to do some additional fleet and total cost of ownership analyses for all the vehicle weight classes, which is really great. So we're working with them to finalize that. We got some sample data from a Vermont landscaping business and one municipality to help inform that analysis. So it's actual data from real entities in Vermont, which is great. So we're hoping to have that done by the end of this week, and we'll be sending a draft of the new, the next phase of the rulemaking packet to Julie sometime next week for her review before we file with LCAR no later than November 1st. So that's where we are. But it's going pretty well. We've gotten through all the comments at this point and have draft responses to all of them. Nothing unexpected.
Is there an LCAR date?
We're planning to file on November 1st, Gina, which should put us on their November 17th hearing schedule, but that's not guaranteed. But hopefully they'll be able to fit us in that day.
Good.
I think they meet on Thursday mornings, usually.
Well, that is great. Thank you for all you and others on your team are lifting. That's really important.
It's been a group effort. We have had a lot of input from VTrans and ACCD and PSD and helping respond to comments. So it's been really great.
How many did you get?
We probably received in total between the in writing and then in person verbal comments, not counting yet all the signatories to some of the letters that were signed on by multiple entities. I'd say about 175 written sets of comments. And then if you count signatories to, like, for example, there was a letter that was sent from, several groups, including like CLF and VNRC and Sierra Club and entities like that. It would probably be closer to like 250 individual commenters. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that work, and thank you for the update. Andrea, you any updates on the carbon reduction strategy planning?
Yeah, not a huge update. We had another, our second technical advisory committee or technical committee meeting last week, where we discussed sort of the scope and the methodology. They went through a bunch of different options and continues to be really good input. So I'm thankful for the group that's involved in that. And then they'll be sort of choosing a path forward on the methodology and applying that to our 23 capital program, and then presenting that back to the group just to get further input on how that goes. Jared and Gina, you guys were there. Do you have anything specific you think this group needs?
I loved it. It was really interesting. And, I'm confident the first part will be done well. The second phase, though, is still very fuzzy. And I know the consultants, and correct me if I'm wrong, they seem to be relying on the advisory committee to shape the direction of that, was the sense that I got. They weren't ready to say, you know, what policies, and I don't expect them to at this point. But I got the sense that there will be more water over the dam before they start honing in on the various policies.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was a little bit of, you're right, discussion on or confusion of like how one part informs the other part.
Yeah.
And if we have this methodology, how are we going to apply it to the capital program? How is that going to help inform the strategy decisions or the programmatic decisions that we make? Because applying it to a capital program sort of is saying, it seems like it's saying like, once the capital program's done, you'll do your analysis, but we're really using all this information to inform what's going into the capital program. And so that can be done early on. So when our capital program comes out, it will be informed by this methodology, and have results from that analysis. So yeah, and then the strategy, I think you're right. During phase 2, the advisory council is going to be providing a lot of input. So I think they're really trying to keep some bookends on the scope of phase 1 right now and get that nailed down, because it's much more broad than just this methodology. So
Yeah.
we'll take a lot of input from a lot of different people and how deep they go on any of those analyses, but that's definitely the later phase.
And
Yes.
remind me, Andrea, on when you, this will obviously be informed by the consultants who are doing a lot in the phase 1 component. When do you anticipate the timing of the ramp of the advisory committee and looking at the phase 2 starting to lift that up?
I have to go back and look at their schedule. I feel like we're a little bit behind where we wanted to be, but I think that's fine because they seem to be okay with getting phase 1 completed by the timeframe that we said. I think the advisory part will come, the advisory committee will be developed like in December, if I had to guess.
That's what I thought it was. I thought it was impressive that it would be before the end of the year.
Yeah. Yep, this isn't their first rodeo.
Yeah, the phase 1 is still for December is when it's supposed to be done.
Phase 1 is no, in January, late January,
Oh.
Ready to report. So they'll do the fiscal year 23 sort of as a test run of the methodology, the capital program for 23, which already exists. And then as we develop the 24 capital program, they'll put it on that, and sort of between the two of those, that'll sort of indicate what our baseline is and how we move forward with strategy development or scenario development.
The only thing I would note that was not clear to me, and I understand that it may not have been clear on its face and may need additional kind of research to arrive at clarity, is when we say the capital program, what is the difference between that and the agency budget? So like a lot of things that in their scope that they proposed looking at the emissions impacts of, it was, you know, capital investments in roadways and bridges and bike ped infrastructure and the transit fleet, but it did not include things like the operations of Vermont's vehicle or even VTran's vehicle fleet that they own and maintain and operate and fuel. And it sounded like what Kevin Marcia was saying is that the capital program is basically the agency budget. And so one question that came up that hopefully we'll get resolution on is, therefore then, should things like, and I'm sure I'm missing things, but the big thing that was obvious to me that was not in their original scope is the emissions from the operations of VTrans and or state-owned vehicles. So
I heard them talking about that. I thought that they're doing a deep dive into that, aren't they, Andrea? In just VTrans's heavy-duty fleet.
I don't know. I think there was some, I'm more on Jared's wavelength of where they were, of whether or not that should be included. I want that included. Our fleet, the statewide fleet, is, I think, beyond the scope of this. but the agencies, because the carbon, and that's what I was trying to say during the meeting, the carbon reduction program funds can go to those types of things. So I think anything that those program funds can go to should be included in this methodology and analysis. So
And when
that
I
might
say
mean we
state,
have to talk that over with them a little bit more. And
I mean, the municipalities will have much to learn from this in terms of their municipal fleets. You know, they tend to look up to V-Trans on how they operate equipment, and it would be very informative, I think, beyond V-Trans's fleet, since we got all these municipalities.
I think that's an important thing for V-Trans to know. So
Yeah.
we'll have those conversations.
that'll be,
I haven't followed up with them since the meeting.
yeah, hopefully that can be included, because it seems appropriate in terms of the scope of the capital program funds or agency budget funds are being used for that. The only reason I was making the distinction, Andrea, between like state fleet and V-Trans fleet is like, it's not clear to me where those lines like start and end. Like, are there fleets that other, like when I was at ACCD, there were 3 agencies up there at National Life, right? And when I went to reserve a car from the state fleet, I don't know if that was an ACCD vehicle or that was like actually owned by V-Trans. So I just don't know like the ownership and purchasing and operations and maintenance budgets of state
Yeah.
fleets. But ideally that could be analyzed, because that should be something that we, as you said, can look at for use of funds to reduce emissions in a very direct way, especially if a lot of the other things they're expecting will not really show major mitigation potential. And again, we're talking at the margins, right? This is V-Trans budget, which is, you know, maybe 1 or 2% of total statewide emissions involved. But if we're going to do it, we might as well do it holistically and well, and get those options on the table.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah, I mean, buildings and general services manages 99% of the passenger fleet.
That the state owns.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of trucks, and I mean, I
We
don't
have
know the
heavy
count at all,
duty.
but we have trucks and dump trucks, and we do have passenger vehicles as well, but yeah.
I've never
the
really
majority of the
understood like the difference between which agencies or departments own their own fleets, and tends to do with the federal funding that they might have available to buy vehicles. Like Fish and Wildlife and A&R doesn't participate in fleet vehicles. Like they have their own vehicles that they manage for their whole department, but the
Yeah.
rest of A&R participates in the fleet with BGS. So like
Right.
some kind of understanding and analysis of like how that all works in order to know what levers you pull would be interesting, actually.
Yeah, and I
This
have to
has
look at
been
the-
around for a decade, let me tell you. What about the woman over at BGS who manages all that? What's her name?
Harmony.
Harmony.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, she came to V-Trans for a little while. Now she's back at BGS.
Well,
That's
that
it,
all
though. Oh, the time. Yeah, sorry, Jane, you get that. I saw your question. That's
timeline.
end of January, February time frame for phase 1. No, well, November is when we have to submit our strategy to Federal Highway. And we asked for phase 2 to be completed in the September timeframe.
Excellent. Well, before we lose Megan, do we want to talk about the transportation memo and next steps there? And just a reminder, this is a transportation memo that we lifted up as a consensus recommendation from cross-sector mitigation to the full council, put it out there. And I think there's general support, and then a couple of folks raised some, I don't think Secretary Moore was there, so didn't have a chance to weigh in. Anyway, maybe the V-Trans team raised some concerns as well. And you, Jane and Andrea, we're going to try to identify what those concerns are and see if and how we might address them. Sorry. Any luck? And
I thought we had all agreed to a draft. and that Andrea had looked at it. Maybe I'm imagining this.
No, we all agreed to a draft. We went through cross-sector mitigation. It went to the council, and then at the council meeting, Gina, I don't know, maybe this was your Italy time, I can't remember, but sometime early September, there was like an informal vote in the chat of who supported it and who supported it with changes and who didn't support it. And I think there was sort of, I don't know, my memory is there was like 8 people who supported it, 3 or 4 that were sort of on the fence, administration members that were sort of support with edit. And those edits have not come yet.
Let's see.
From the administration. So that's where we're at. But they are around the language and the recommendation of the policy avenue. So I don't have anything more to report on that. I haven't heard anything from Michelle.
Yeah.
The language,
I can. Oh, yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I can at least speak to process at this point, from what I understand, and how at least the administration plans to respond. And so I haven't heard any other specific components of the recommendation. I think this goes for AOT as well. That doesn't mean that they won't highlight them at some point, but I have only heard a specific consternation and heartburn around the sentence around that the only way to meet our emissions it's not even, and this is where I was trying to open it so I can refresh my memory. It's really in the body of the memo. And I have to just, I'll say on the record in the recorded meeting, I was kind of bummed that we didn't dive deeper into the biomass conversation, because some of the questions that came with biomass today at the council are the same questions I have about process for this memo and addendum to a cap. I am sort of left struggling a little bit about like what gets addended, like added on to the cap. Is it the whole memo? Is it the actual bulleted recommendations? Because I'm just a little confused on process still around what the council's like voting on. So we can talk about that from a memo, but I should open this to remind myself, but what I've heard is that one consternation around that sentence that isn't in the bulleted part, but because the bulleted parts, if I remember, but check me if I'm wrong, are really sort of tangible next steps to continue to make progress in the name of ultimately determining the final policy rec. But there's that sentence at the beginning in the sort of contextualizing that speaks to like without a sector-wide policy. Yeah, Andrea, that one. She just put it in the chat that like the administration won't sign on to that statement, and they feel that others that they've heard from others in the council, I'll say Secretary Moore and others, have suggested that that sentence generally poses problems for. I'm not sure it's only the administration, I'll just say it, but I don't have direct knowledge of any other specific counselor. But so the next step I have not gotten any edits or suggested changes on that, but I took the first shot at trying to articulate sort of a current thinking and response on behalf to Julie on sort of a memo in response to the transportation memo. And I'm not sure, and then Andrea and Megan have sort of ground checked everything in there and made it more clear. And that memo will go to Julie tonight for Julie to consider how she wants to utilize it, whether she'll send it more as a sort of just current thinking of articulation for not being able to support this component, or whether she'll use it to articulate an administrative position around the memo more broadly. I don't know yet, but I was asked to put together sort of a memo in response to the memo around some current thinking for Julie, and Megan and Andrea had a chance to weigh in on that for me.
Is the problem with that sentence the only currently known, or is it the mention of cap and invest? Or you don't know? What's
the whole thing?
The whole thing, because they're two sort of hot button items in there. One is, this is the only currently known way to do it. And then we're mentioning something that's controversial, or it's just a combination of both.
Yeah, I mean, I
So-
think that the case continues to be around sort of, it's like for the component of considering what we're going to learn through the carbon reduction strategy and understanding that analysis and having that play out. And then in my consideration and my current understanding, which we can discuss and I tried to put forward in the memo, is I think that there's this question of long-term funding needs, which I think is the question in case that Julie's trying to sort of tease out from the question of what's the end game of the policy? Is it to determine a long-term funding source, or is it to further reduce emissions outside of the mechanisms that we have in place right now? And this is where, I mean, while I have the floor and I don't want to create sort of controversy or debate, but I still like, and Megan has heard me over and over about this and continues to educate me and my understanding on this, but you know, the main short-term, the primary short-term emissions reduction strategy between now and 2030 is the deployment of EVs. And if ACC2 gets us all the EVs we're going to get between now and 2030, my question continues to be, and that only gets us a third of the way there. That's not to say that we don't need more funding and ongoing funding to ensure that those EVs are placed in service in Vermont. But I just can't see the path to close the gap with being like 2/3 short on EVs. What are the other short-term drivers of emissions reductions to close that?
Making it so people can buy them, because that will get them here. The question is, do we have enough funding to do the incentives and the programs for low and moderate income
But
families?
even if those are all on the road through our best efforts and successful efforts of getting all of these cars from Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks on the road, we still are at that short point. We still have a big gap to fill.
So I think that there's two things that I think about in relation to this. One is, we can't assume that just because the vehicles are delivered, they're going to be placed in service. And so there may need to be additional funds beyond what will already be available at the federal and state level, not just for incentives, but for charging infrastructure as well. We know that there's a lot of that already, but I feel like we don't know. I just don't think that we can assume that just because there's a requirement that those vehicles be provided, that they get purchased and placed into service. And so that's where a strategy like Cap and Invest could ensure that there are additional funds to be able to support charging infrastructure, to support incentives, especially with more of an equity focus. Although I do think that the other big thing here is that there are strategies aside from electric vehicles in terms of investing in transit. And you know, we've seen lots of studies around, you know, micro transit and on-demand transit and different models that could help folks get out of dependence on single occupancy vehicles. The other thing is that there are short-term opportunities in terms of biofuels, especially on the biodiesel side for medium and heavy duty equipment, that if we're able to use biodiesel at a blended level for some equipment, that could also further reduce emissions in a way that is not dependent on electrification. So while I agree that electrification of the vehicle fleet is by far the most significant kind of way that will achieve our emissions reduction requirements by 2030, I don't think it's fair or accurate to say that it's, you know, the sole strategy at our disposal. And I'm not saying you're saying it's the sole, but it sounds like what you're saying, Jane, is if we're going to get the number of electric vehicles we're going to get from Advanced Clean Cars 2, then what else could we get through another? And my point would be with a performance standard, at least, there would be incentives for fuels in existing vehicles. I think this is especially true for diesel dependent vehicles that could displace a lot of fossil fuel use by blending or using B100 in certain circumstances. And I don't think that should be, there's no silver bullet here. It's gonna be silver buckshot. So I don't think we can take off the table some of those policy strategies.
There's everything that's in the cap that needs to be done, that needs to be funded. I mean, Jared
Yeah,
just.
I think that's what the CRS is looking at.
Yeah. And I'm really interested in seeing how transit fares in the analysis that VTrans is doing. And maybe that will be a way we can flex more money into transit programs if we can show there's some real emissions benefits. That could be very cool. Yeah, I mean, it's endless what we need money for in this transition. You just can read the cap and see it all there.
No, I agree. And I think, I guess, Jane, in terms of the feedback and the memo, I think it would be really helpful to me, either from you or Secretary Moore, to be very clear about what we're saying in terms of, and or what the suggested answer is. So if we're saying if the view is we don't need a sustained revenue source, or we think we're going to get as far as we can with advanced clean cars, I just would be really clear to have that articulated. Because I guess, anyway, it would just be very helpful to me to understand what the recommended solution and strategy forward is, if not what is currently articulated on the page. So to be as clear as possible about, that would be very helpful. Because I don't think, like, we've been spending a lot of time, and we went through a whole process to develop the climate action plan built on processes before that highlighted the need for, different policy and regulatory tools that will reduce emissions and then raise revenues. And so not much is new there. Waiting for the carbon reduction strategy. I guess I'm just trying to understand and game out what we're trying to do here. And so I'd very much love to hear from the secretary or secretaries, their clear vision and their suggestions for next steps. And if it's just wait for the carbon reduction strategy and hope it all adds up, I don't know. Not sure if that's what they're saying, but so.
I would just offer, I'm not sure that what I put in the chat is not clunky, but when I look at the existing language, I can see how somebody would see that as clunky if you don't read it fully and carefully, because what we're not saying is that the only currently known way to deliver with high confidence and effective equitable path to reduce emissions in the transportation sector is A or B policy. It's that key next phrase, to meet our emissions reduction requirements. There's all sorts of ways that you can reduce emissions and do so equitably. But the question to me is to do so with confidence that we have the ability to, or have a real shot at meeting the requirements. And I think unless and until there is a cap instituted, or there is a performance standard based on emissions related to fuel use, everything else is just throwing stuff against the wall. And it may or may not add up, we don't really know. So I wonder if this second phrasing is clearer about what we really intended in this task group, and I could see somebody reading what's currently in the draft and saying, of course, there's ways to deliver effective, equitable emissions reduction in the transportation sector that aren't those two policies. But to me, the key point is that there's not evidence from other jurisdictions that you can do so at the scale and pace as required by our emissions reduction requirements, that you could do it without at least one of those two policies. And so my question is, if there are folks in the administration who disagree with that statement, where's the evidence? What is the other policy or regulatory strategy that has been shown somewhere else to confidently reduce emissions at the scale and pace that we're required to do? if not utilizing one or both of those two tools? Like, I think that's the burden of proof. If they're going to disagree with that, what is it? Where else do you see evidence for something that could do this at scale and pace confidently in line with our requirements? Otherwise, I think it's a political discomfort with pointing to policies, but that shouldn't be our concern. Our job is to say what can work or what can't work based on our analysis and being, fully honest and truthful. And I think if there's just a discomfort with that the question will just need to be called, and it will have to have a vote in the council.
I mean,
And
Jared,
or I'm just curious, well, just really quickly, because just following it, because it's sort of alluding to what I was suggesting, is it just be helpful to understand with greater specificity if there are strategies that we may not be aware of, because I know that the A&R has tools in its toolbox to, that would require the transportation sector to clean up in a different way, like more quickly. I mean, it could take a regulatory approach. So I'm just curious if that is part of the thinking, it would be helpful to know that sooner rather than later. So clarity on what the proposed solution or compendium of solutions would be real helpful.
and also I think it's incumbent on us to say, well, if you spend X million dollars next year on charging stations and credits in stuff, programs to help move purchase along, what will that mean in terms of getting to our goals? So they're saying, we got all this federal largesse, we're doing all these programs, mission accomplished. And we need to say, or somebody needs to say, no, wait a minute, X amount isn't going to get us there. We need double that or triple that, or in these programs will bring us that, along with some surety about the emissions. See, I see it an issue on both sides. We have to be able to say, these are the only options, and throwing all this money against the wall at this point in time isn't necessarily going to get us there.
It's really, I mean, I think that's just, it seems like an easy thing to do, Gina, but I don't think it is when you start putting pen to paper and all the different factors that will go into whether or not our sector, our habits become, that we get enough electric vehicles. It's so hard to tell. Like right now, 40% of vehicles purchased are getting incentives. I think it's something like that. But then there's just other factors that go in. If we take our current funding and say, okay, that's going to get us this many incentives, so that means this many cars, but we don't necessarily, I mean, to predict the market rate of just in general what that's going to be. And it's not a simple, straightforward calculation. Like this much money gets you this many incentives, and so we're either there or we're not. It's more complicated than that.
And so much of it is that we can't spend our way out of the solution here isn't just increasing public expenditures on these things. It is setting equipment standards like we're doing in the transportation sector, but have not done for the thermal sector yet. And it's sending market clarity through caps or performance standards that this is the direction that obligated entities need to move in. All this is about trying to incentivize individual consumers and the hundreds of thousands of individual decisions that Vermonters make without coordinated policy and regulatory strategy that's aimed at the fuel suppliers importing the fuel and the vehicle. So we're just focused on the regulations and requirements on vehicle manufacturers in the vehicles they deliver to Vermont through Advanced Clean Cars 2. There is no accountability or tracking or requirement on the fuel importers. And so what that does is push down to like, oh, can we just have enough incentives that, but it's all downstream, and you never know if that's gonna add up.
Yeah, that was something that I don't think Julie understood that when we were having all our conversations about cap and trade last year. Did I get that wrong, where seemed to be this gap in knowledge of what the regional, or maybe that was just specific to Vermont and the fuel that's delivered in Vermont. There seemed to be a gap in understanding of this obligation and what it would mean in terms of the fuel supply and the emissions benefits.
You mean the reporting, or do you mean the actual question that I remember Secretary Young actually kept asking a
Yeah,
lot of questions about sort of like,
yes, it was.
you know, the fact that we have a Vermont law in the book and the regional nature of TCIP and where those most cost-effective emissions reductions would be realized.
I
She kept-
thought,
Jean and Andrea. Oh, go ahead.
go on.
Well, I mean, I feel like we've had similar conversations. I feel like the ball is in your court / the secretary's courts. And I mean, I think we've been clear because we've also co-created this together. I think we're generally all knowing where we're coming from. So I don't think we need to like beat this conversation around any further. I don't want to cut off the conversation, but I guess it would just be most helpful for me to better understand with more clarity what the proposed alternative to this memo / like what's the proposal to fill the gap, or just to acknowledge that we're not going to recommend filling the gap because that would just be,
or that members of the administration won't. I mean,
that's what I'm asking
to-
for, clarity.
yeah.
And I mean, I'm sorry that this is directed towards Andrea and Jane, but you're our conduit to the people it seems to have that seem to have concerns. So my ask to you is just a request for concrete input on what is the suggested solution and strategy. And if the strategy is just acquiescing to it not adding up, or adding up with the level of certainty as we've heard before, then that just needs to be clear so that everyone knows where we are. That's all.
If I can just add to that, I mean, I'm really concerned about the timeline here. We had committed to November. We got these recommendations developed and then up through in a consensus approved by cross-sector to meet that timeline. And I don't want to it feels like there's been and I don't know what the reasons are, but there's been a delay on the couple of administration members who've raised concerns after there was consensus agreement from everybody else on the council when these were first floated. And my worry is that because we're not getting anything specific back on proposed different language, or, you know, is there that we're not going to have enough time for this task group to consider that language for us to bring anything back to cross-sector. And so, you know, I think that, and so then it feels like it's just going to be a push to further delay, which I don't think is fair on this process. So I feel like we need to set a deadline by which we could onboard any feedback into this task group and then back up through cross-sector to make sure that we're able to have this as an agenda item to be finished at the November 17th council meeting. And I'm just looking at, I don't think cross-sector meets again
Well, cross-sector is supposed to meet on Thursday.
until this Thursday, and we're not going to meet again before then.
I'll just pause right here, because I would assume at this point, and Andrea, you can correct me wrong if AOT plans to proceed differently, but I just understanding where the administration has been on past policy like this, my understanding and expectation is they just won't support the memo at this point because of language around this policy. And that, I think that they likely will offer a counter view of why, which is what, Joey, you're asking for, right? Like, why don't they support this?
And what's their proposed solution?
Right. What their proposed solution may be, we're acknowledging that our approach by throwing money at it is what we need, and that's what we're going to stand by. It might not be conducive to what the council supports. And I think that was what happened with TCIP and the cap. And I think the council can and should move forward with the language as drafted in the memo, and then it'll have to go to a vote. And I just think that's, unless I don't anticipate Secretary Moore and the executive committee that she meets with, including Secretary Flynn, to propose alternatives to this memo. I could be different, but I do not expect that. So I think we should proceed with the understanding that they're just not going to support this, and they're going to have a rationale that they lay out. Hopefully they preview that with you both and this task group, all of you, ahead of the meeting, so that there can be productive civil discourse about it, but I would just proceed with the expectation that the memo as is likely going to be advanced with legislative council support and not by the administration.
Well, wait a second though. Okay. So I thought we've been waiting because the secretary and Michelle had raised, like, we want to weigh in and suggest amendments to this memo. And now you're telling me something a little different, like we should just move.
I never heard that. Sorry. Maybe you did, but I never heard that they were going to give you written.
Well, the
feedback.
voting was, I support it with suggested amendments, the vote, so they, and then
that feels like nuance to me based on how David put that forward. That doesn't feel, sorry. My apologies if I misinterpreted that, but
That's what we were
I thought you
waiting
just
for.
wanted to know what
yeah, I
their
thought we were just waiting for their
legislative-
suggestions and amendments, and so, I
thought
mean,
you
if
just
we were
wanted to
just
know what
gonna-
their legit concerns were with the memo, and if there were tangible components that would make it fixed. I think that if you took out this sentence, and if you took out a sentence like this and just had the recommendations, they'd probably support the next step of recommendations. Can't say that 100% though.
My personal view is we can't take out this sentence because it's the summary of the research and conversations that and due diligence we have done. And so if the concern is just the presence of this overall idea that you need policy drivers to confidently reduce emissions, and you can't just incentivize everything and hope that you're going to get there with any degree of certainty, then yeah, I think we need to call the question. It would have been helpful to know that a month ago, right? So we weren't like waiting on specific language suggestions that we thought were coming from them. But if
I think that's a misinterpretation between us and me. So that's not the fault of them. I thought you were waiting on concerns. I could have told you from the beginning you were never going to get specific line item like drafting edits from Secretary Moore.
well, I guess my thought with waiting for concerns would be an articulation of what we can do to address those concerns in a way that, again, I think what you're hearing from us is that we've taken our charge to put forward recommendations in line with the law. Anyway,
Yeah,
and
I think if you say like what could be changed about the memo for it to be acceptable to those members that wanted changes, that could mean two things. Either they're going to put forward a different suggestion, or they're going to just say, change the memo to exclude certain parts, and we'd accept it. It's taken a while to get there, and I can understand the frustration. But
I mean, I just frankly feel like we're having, I feel like I've been in so many of these conversations for many, many years now that ultimately it would just be real helpful. Scrap the memo and the process that led up to it for years. And if they have a recommendation for how to move forward in the transportation space, start there. Like maybe that's what what is their answer? The whole Global Warming Solutions Act is premised on the fact that we've been pontificating and punting for a real long time in state government. So, and I don't put this all on, this administration, but I think what we're trying to do here is figure out how do we move the ball and move towards a program that delivers more cost-effective, cleaner vehicles. And when we're talking about transportation and cleaner transportation options, but how do we do that? How do you build and transform? You need a level of policy and regulatory environment that supports it. And that's what I think we're grappling with. So if there's a different way just to gain clarity about exactly what they're proposing we do, let's just cut through the chaos and stop having the same conversation and hear it. That'd be helpful to me. And again, we've invited this before. It would also be helpful to not have you guys, be the intermediaries, like it would be helpful to just better understand that directly from them, maybe.
How about this? I don't think we can get rid of that sentence without changing the whole meaning. I've just looked it over again. We could suggest Jared's revisions, and if they don't like that, then I think we walk and say, this is what we've worked on. This is what was left from our last spring when we wrapped up the cap. We need to bring this to and you guys you guys from the state won't be able to, won't obviously be participating in that conversation if they don't agree with some softening of the sentence per Jared's requirements. I don't see how we can take it out, really, without changing the meaning. I think
Yeah, because then our cap recommendations become what every state has been criticized for, kind of vague pointing in the direction we need to go without any specificity in terms of the policy or regulatory actions that could actually achieve them. And it doesn't meet our legal requirement, and it would be embarrassing
it's what all the plans have done to this point. It's all the plans that.
I guess, so I'll say I don't have a problem with this sentence, and because I actually think, I 100% agree that the statement that right here is true, and I don't think anybody could disagree with that statement. And what I actually appreciated about that statement is it's not getting at the where I draw a line and have a hard time coming over the hurdle is the capacity or the known actual specific program to stand up, right? So that statement makes a lot of sense to me, right? And I 110% agree that statement makes sense. Has any small state
right.
stood up a program like this? No, and how we actually do it on a meaningful timeline that makes it worthwhile between now and 2030, that gets us, it seems totally hard, I'm not saying impossible, but hard to do. And as Jared, I appreciate your optimism, but when we heard from Washington State that they're hiring 70 people to join WCI, that's just, and it's impossible. WCI is the only viable program right now that we could think about joining into, and it's not really viable for Vermont to join in. So it's
we also heard from Oregon that their clean fuel standard program, which covers the transportation sector, has 4 or 5 staff. What was that?
I also heard last week that they're likely going to pull out of their cap and invest if the governor gets elected. I
wasn't talking about cap and invest for Oregon. I'm talking about their clean fuel standard program, which is a performance standard program on their transportation, on their fossil fuel importers. And that program, if I'm recalling correctly from the testimony of their program director, has a staff of 4 or 5 people, or at least that's what it originally was stood up as. It may be, 5 or 6 now. So I think that the point, I think it's valuable to have this conversation, because I think that there are people who think that it's not possible to meet the requirements. I disagree. And I certainly don't think we can't say, or that we can say we can't meet the requirements without trying and using the tools in our policy and regulatory toolbox.
Agree.
Can't give up before we've even tried. And we do know that Vermont has evidence of standing up cap programs, often Reggie was in coordination with other states, but we stood up the Renewable Energy Standard Program. Granted, the electricity sector is different than the transportation sector, with a different number of obligated entities and different complexity. But I do think that there are examples from other states, and Oregon is one of them. They're significantly bigger than us, but they're 4 million people. They're not California, of standing up a performance standard program for the transportation sector, of standing up a statewide cap and reduce program that includes covering the transportation sector. So, I don't think that we can say it's not possible. I think there's evidence both from Vermont's history and from other states that we can lean on and borrow from to do it. Will it be difficult? Yes, but we can't say no without even trying, because we know we won't meet the legal
So the
requirements.
point right now is, and I agree, Jane, with what you just said, we're opening a door to these options, and there's going to be a pantload of work to understand the costs, to understand the structure. We may find we can't do it alone, that we have to enter into a regional agreement with other states. But we at least, and that's where we can add some language here, I think. Yes, we're going to do it, but we were going to start an investigation into doing it. We're not
Yeah.
going to
Mhm.
do it.
I just-
It's
I
going
wanna
to
ask-
take a lot of work.
I want to ask this group what they feel about, because I feel like there's a bit of middle ground here with one of the recommendations in here and the actions that Jane and Megan have talked about doing is that last bullet about the accurate data and a reporting program. And just, it feels like any of these programs, whether it's a standard or a cap and invest or anything, everybody that Jane and A&R have talked to says, get the data first. And that takes a couple of years to stand up and then
Mhm.
collect and have enough information to move forward. So I feel like even if we're not all saying we're moving forward on a cap and invest, we're moving forward on steps to get to something else, you know? So I just kind of want to get people's input on how they feel about that part of it. Because I feel like we're making progress. I know everybody that has been in this for 15 or 20 years feels like it's not progress fast enough. But at this point where we are, this is sort of the next step for anything is to get data. So we're doing
I
it.
think making the connection between that data collection and getting to these policies would be important, because right now it's just intuitive, it's not stated. I hear you.
Yeah, Mhm.
That's part of the pant load of work that's got to go on to get to a policy that's appropriate for Vermont.
I wonder if it's okay to leave it just intuitive though, and implied only because
Yeah,
can, yeah.
takes away
Because
some
it
of
is
the
so
some of the
important
pressure.
we have buy-in. Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's really important that that is a bullet point. And I think you're right, Andrea, that that is a key first step. But that's, and I don't know that there's more to say about that.
Yeah, I totally
Certainly
agree.
couldn't be the only step.
Completely agree. And
Well, and then you have the other bullet of developing a framework for legal jurisdiction. I haven't heard specifically, and I don't know what will come from a response from the administration, but I haven't heard anything specifically balking at that bullet. I don't know exactly what that means or what steps need to move forward to, I don't know, to move that bullet point forward. I don't know exactly what that means. I haven't the whole time, but if you're doing that, and if you're doing the data collection, like, aren't we sort of gearing up for, and then we're doing the CRS and we're figuring out what we're gonna get from the transportation programs, which admittedly probably is not gonna be huge immediate, but we might be making some progress in the long term, like adding all of those pieces up and moving forward
Mhm.
doesn't.
I guess, yeah, no, I think all of it's important. I'm hoping, and we can use Jared's new sentence to offer a little more clarity. I totally agree, Andrea. And at the same time, I guess it feels like the CRS is also recognizing that we're going to probably need some overarching strategy. So maybe if there's something on in the carbon reduction strategy that is not listed here, we can add that. But I think I see them as
I mean, I think we have the suite of possibilities and potentials. I don't think there's anything hiding that someone's going to pull out of their pocket at this point. The proposal from Cambridge
which is why I
Systematics.
just don't think that from the way I look at the world, the sentence that we're talking about does not contradict what the carbon reduction strategy is
I
pointing
know,
toward.
but it's not, if it doesn't sit well with the administration, and it could be more advantageous to the intent of this group or the Climate Council in general to wordsmith it in such a way that it doesn't really matter what it says, because you're doing other things that are advancing potentially towards that goal.
Well, I guess, yes. I mean, the piece of it, again, for me is just that would just love to understand the rationale and the solution that it's taking the place of our memo. Because I really just, if we're all generally pointing in the same direction, then I just want clarity around what that pathway looks like from the administration's perspective, because anyway.
mean, I would just say, Andrea, I agree with you that a number of things that are in this memo that don't relate to this sentence that's causing heartburn among appointees of the administration are necessary first steps. But I don't think that it would be sufficient to just point to them, because they're only valuable to the extent that they then lead to other actions. Not only valuable, but they're primarily valuable to the extent that they lead to other actions that fulfill the charge that was given to us to make recommendations that can achieve the GWSA requirements. So if we stop, I don't know if this is what you're saying. It sounds like what you're saying is like, well, if we know that in the next year we have to set up a reporting program anyway, and that's going to be the main focus, and we're not going to be ready to immediately join or establish a CAP program or a performance standard program in the next year, then why not just point to the data and analytical work in the meantime? To me, in the climate action plan, we have many recommendations that are not ripe to be implemented this year, but that we need to point to for future years to be able to meet 2030 and other out year requirements. So to me, I'm just saying I would not be comfortable at all if we don't point in the direction that we believe at this point in time is necessary. I'm just going to go back to, like, I know these are political questions, but to me, I go back to, what does the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is the law of the land in Vermont, charge us to do? And it put on us the responsibility to deliver a plan that can meet the requirements. And without this specific language in there, I don't think that we're pointing to recommended policy actions that can actually get us there. But I do think that it's not appreciated enough, and I'm not saying by you two, but just generally, the fact that we're putting multiple policy options on the table and not prescribing one approach. I mean, it was interesting to hear, the conservative government in Nova Scotia saying, well, we prefer a performance standard to a cap and invest. So we're going to, not be part of WCI. We're going to do a performance standard instead. I would love to hear the administration engage in a serious policy debate about what are the policy mechanisms that can achieve these requirements, rather than just saying, no, we don't like any policy proposal that is not spending federal dollars that we get, or that is not continuing a commitment we already made as a Section 209 state to follow California's air. There's nothing new on the policy or regulatory front that is at a significant scale that is being proposed, and you just cannot meet these requirements without new policy or regulatory mechanisms.
Okay, I feel like we've been clear, and I'm wondering if we can just clarify exact next steps. And I am wondering, Jean and others, do you think, I told Rich and TJ that I was just waiting to get back to them about whether or not there's substantive, topics for an agenda and a conversation on Thursday, which is our next cross-sector meeting. And I said, wait until after we have this conversation. I will hope to have more clarity, because we were going to get input from you guys from the secretaries. But I am underscoring Jarrett's concern about the timing and the timeline. So if we don't have input from them by Thursday, then we won't have another cross-sector meeting for at least few weeks.
Until after the next council meeting, when we're supposed to.
Well, we clearly need it before then, and maybe we'll have to have, does that mean we have to have like a special cross-sector meeting? Or do you think we can get input, Jane, by like tomorrow, and then we have a cross-sector meeting? Okay. I mean, how long what sort of timeline are we on? Because
I just to send Julie the memo tonight, which I'm on track to do. Andrea and Megan got me comments, and so I just have to revise it this evening. And then I'm scheduled to meet with Julie at my check-in, and that's what we're supposed to talk about on Friday, a response. But I know that they meet as an executive committee, and Andrea wondered, which allowed to me today, and I don't know what the answer to this is Julie wasn't able to attend the executive committee that they had last Thursday, where they were going to talk about this in prep for today. So it's not like they intentionally just blew off this deadline. The majority of the administration had met last Thursday, and Julie just couldn't be there because she was at a conference in New Orleans. So I don't know if, I don't know once Julie is prepared or briefed, how she plans to circle up with the other administration officials. I think it's normally a core group. My understanding is that Secretary Flynn, Secretary Moore, Commissioner Tierney, and Secretary Clauser that meet as a small group.
I mean, one option could be postponing the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting that's scheduled for Thursday, not having it, and seeing if we can meet as a task group next Monday. If they met, say, if cross-sector moved a couple weeks, say to November 3rd, because my understanding from Rich, I talked to him briefly earlier, is there's no other agenda items. And this would be the only one. So if not for something on this, they would be likely to cancel it. So what if we propose to Rich and TJ postponing the next cross-sector meeting for 2 weeks until the 3rd, which could happen after a transportation task group meeting. Oh no, that's on Halloween. I am not spending 3:30 on a transportation task group rather than taking my kid trick-or-treating.
No.
I mean, the only other, it's cutting it really close. The only other option could be we meet as a task group on Monday the 7th, cross-sector moves to Thursday the 10th, and then we've got the council meeting on the 14th.
I think maybe we can just look at different days as a group, only because if you want the Climate Council to act on the recommendations, it'd be great. I know that it's on behalf of the admin that you're holding this up, but it'd be great to get them the final recommendations with plenty of time.
Well, and I feel like the council was ready to move forward, except for those two concerns brought up by Kristen and Michelle, and then later Julie. So, I mean, if all that's going to happen is what you assumed, Jane, earlier in this call, is they're going to say, no, we just oppose this language. And if we think that it needs to be in there, it's just going to end up having to call the question, then, there's not really anything different to do.
Mm-hmm. Let's plan like there might be, if we can. If we can use the next 5 minutes just to think through a schedule, and then when I meet with Julie on Friday and go through the memo, I can go point to point through all the recommendations with her, because every time I've talked with her about it, we've focused in on that initial sentence, maybe with this additional language, and then going through the other recommendations, I can see if there's other things more specifically. Let me see where we are. So the 17th. So if the idea would be that we would get cross-sector to hopefully move till November 3rd, and us as a group, instead of meeting on the 31st, we could try to meet on the 1st.
It could work.
Does that work for others if we just moved it to the 1st instead of having it on Halloween? That time doesn't work for me on the 1st, but I'm free from 12 to 3. I'm actually free from 11 to 3.
I'm free at 1:30. We did 1:30 to 3.
Does that work for others?
I can't do that. Noon? No. I could do noon.
But
Not you, Jared?
No,
This is back to the 31st?
The 1st.
Oh, the 1st. Oh, yeah, that's.
what about?
Can we?
30% more?
Hmm?
I
Go
was
ahead.
just wondering about in the morning instead.
I could do 8.
Yeah, I'm going to be on Mountain Time.
I have my annual physical at 8:20.
10?
Those are very
10
different. I could do 10.
10 is perfect.
10 a.m. Jane? 10?
Mhm.
Andrea? Going once? Going twice? 10 a.m. Ding, ding, ding.
November 1st at 10, I can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm distracted. I have to get kids out to soccer.
Yeah,
Gotta go.
that's
That meeting was in
that's
person.
way more fun. And oh, by the way, this is the only reason I'm continuing to have these painful conversations. It's so frustrating is because we have children. Okay, can we call this meeting and we're scheduling it. Jane's gonna.
Jane will
I'm going to
do
send
her
an update
magic
right
with
now.
cross sector and,
Mhm.
okay.
Sorry, I just want to make sure we're clear on that next step with closing the loop with cross sector. Is Jane, are you going to follow up with TJ and Rich about proposing to reschedule that meeting?
Sure. I can call TJ right now. Yeah. Or
That'd be
chat. I can team chat him right now.
That'd be great.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
I just sent. Okay. I'm going to stop recording.
Great.